Hi, everybody, and welcome to Making Your Voice Heard, Advocating for Research. I'm Kathy Ormerod. I'm the Executive Vice President for Strategy and Mission at Living Beyond Breast Cancer. And we are really grateful for you to spend your afternoon with us today. So we deliver about 40% of all our programming for the metastatic breast cancer community. So I urge you to look at our videos, look at other content we have on our website, lbbc.org. We also have our helpline to help match you with a peer to get the support that you need. So there are many ways, much content out there for you. We also have leadership advocacy programs, and you'll hear us talk about a few of them today. So we are grateful again for you being here. And I just want to say during the pandemic, it's really because of your support that we are able to offer programs like this. And if you're able to make a donation today, please do so, lbbc.org/donate. So we have a rock star panel today, advocacy leaders who are working to advance research. They're working to change the systems and organizations in which research lives and thrives. And they are all dedicated metastatic breast cancer advocates and working to advance treatments for people living with metastatic breast cancer. So we have 60 minutes, a lot of ground to cover. And when this hour concludes, I hope you will better understand the research advocacy landscape. You'll meet some of the most exciting leaders in the community who are impacting positive change. They're addressing and disrupting disparities, healthcare disparities in breast cancer. And each of our panelists is working on multiple levels to make changes. There are individual levels, organizational, clinical levels, governmental, and industry levels. So by the end of this hour, we hope you can also see where you might join some of these efforts to make changes. So I want to remind you, we are going to take questions throughout the program. So if you have them, please enter them in the Q&A box. There's a Q&A box and a chat box. Please enter your questions for the panelists in the Q&A box. But we want you to chat in the chat box, as many of you are now telling us where you're from. So that's also at the bottom of the screen. Make sure you're not just addressing the panelist, that you're addressing all the attendees. Okay, we're going to get started, and I'm going to introduce you to each of the panelists with my first question. So I will call out my first question. Disparities in breast cancer treatment and outcomes were illuminated by the pandemic and the social justice movements and began in 2020. But the work has been ramping up for many, many years. And Mema Karmo, who is the CEO of Tiger Lily, has been at the forefront of this change. But Mema, during the pandemic, you and Tiger Lily really took a visionary and a grassroots approach to solving, and I know you want to solve, healthcare disparities in breast cancer. And you started something called the Tiger Lily Inclusion Pledge, and you started a program actually in 2019, the Tiger Lily's MBC Angel Advocacy Program. So I'd love you to tell us about both of these initiatives and some of your key accomplishments to date.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm so honored to be here as a 15-year triple negative breast cancer survivor and thriver, and honored to serve in this way. When I think about diversity and inclusion, the analogy that comes to mind is one that I heard that reminds me of what's called the chicken and the pig. So the chicken is like being like diversity, it's involved, right? It'll give you the egg, lay the egg, but the pig is invested. And so when we look at partners that we've been talking about, how do you invest in people who are Black and brown? And how do you assess your own biases within yourself and your company? The Inclusion Pledge is really a tangible framework that gives people smart goals to work towards inclusion. And so if you're somebody who's never experienced racism or never been in Black skin, you really can't understand what we live with, what we go through, and the barriers we face. And so we've been working with our partners to really look at themselves again, look at their biases, look at the way they've not been inclusive, and really work with us as Black and Brown people and patients to assess ways they can use their privilege for power to change and become more inclusive. When we began this work, really it started with, me, Julia Mawis and Christine Hodgdon, sitting in a car. We're on a call one day in a parking lot talking about how they as white people could use their privilege. And I've been to many conferences where I wasn't asked to speak or wasn't asked to share my opinion. I'd be a Black woman in the room, in the back of the room. And I was like, why are you talking about D&I and disparities and I'm not being able to say my opinion and share my thoughts? And so we really began to say, look at how do we ensure our white allies could use their privilege for power, and also how do we as Black people help our allies understand the ways they can kind of lean in to be more inclusive. And so the pledge came about by literally asking one partner, if you can see my humanity and see what I've been through, how can that help you to be more inclusive in your work and more diverse? And what are you doing that you don't know you're doing that's wrong, that helps people of color to have, or hurts them in terms of health and equity and quality of life? And so we had one partner look into themselves and look at what they were doing, assess their systems, assess their people, assess the way that they were brought up as people, because they're born in a body that has predisposition to be maybe racist or not see certain things. And over time, the pledge grew to now a global outcry, and it's really grown a lot, and I'm really proud of what's happened with the Inclusion Pledge.
And you've involved corporations and industry partners, as well as individuals and organizations living beyond breast cancer signed on to the Inclusion Pledge.
Well, yeah, the power in the pledge is we've been asking people who are stakeholders, what can you do as an advocacy group, as pharma, as a CRO, as a scientist, as a researcher, as a person? What is one thing you can do to ensure that you're looking at yourself to be more inclusive? And it's been really powerful. You all signed the pledge when we first started, and it's been really awesome seeing you guys have more diversity on your board and have your event last year, Knowledge is Power, and really transform how you're being more inclusive in the Black community.
Great. And on a grassroots level, you trained metastatic breast cancer advocates to get involved and to change. Can you tell us about the Angel Advocacy Program?
Yeah, so, when I look at advocacy, you see myself, you see Jamil, you see Stephanie, you may see other people who are Black and Brown, but they're not many of us. And I was going to many a conference and many a symposium and not seeing people like us represented, not hearing our voices. And like I said before, being in the back of the room. And so I began to ask myself, what if there were more of us at the table? How do I make that happen? And so we reached out to patients of color in areas that had the highest breast cancer death rate for Black women and asked them to be part of our training to learn about disparities, to learn about breast cancer and MBC. And it was really amazing how how big the response was. We trained about 50 women last year. We have 120 now in our new cohort, and that's growing. And they're being taught about breast cancer. They're being taught to learn about clinical trials. They're being taught to use their voice and their power and to speak up and to speak out. And they're partnering with Pharma to better make trials more diverse and more inclusive. They're partnering with scientists to be part of research. And so it's been really amazing to see people who didn't know what existed for them or that they had a table to come to that table and to learn and be empowered to use their voices in the communities nationally and globally.
Great, thank you. And you recruit for people at the end of the year, is that right?
The end of the year, but actually all throughout the year, it's a rolling cohort. Yes.
It's a rolling cohort. Okay, so we're trying to give people some ideas about how they might get involved. So thank you, Mayma. Jamil. Jamil Rivers, you are living with metastatic breast cancer. You were diagnosed just a few years ago at the age of 39. You're a wife, a mother, a nonprofit CEO. You're very busy, but you immediately jumped into advocacy and you joined LBBC's Young Advocate Program. You joined our board. We saw you as such a leader. We asked you to join our board. And you're now a board of Medivivor and chair of that board, in fact. And to top it all off this year, you started the Chrysalis Initiative. And you talk about being a disruptor of healthcare disparities, breast cancer disparities. So I'd love to hear you explain a little bit about how the Chrysalis Initiative is disrupting those disparities, both in your navigation program, but you also have an organization, you help healthcare systems as well.
Yes.
So tell us.
Well, as a Black woman living with MBC, and, I got involved with advocacy right away just because I realized how complex breast cancer is. And I knew that there was a lot to learn. And also shockingly, being now, this far along in breast cancer and treatment and research and innovation, knowing that Black women are dying at a 40% higher rate from breast cancer. So of course I needed to figure out why. I'm a Black woman. I want to be here for my family. And being an advocate, I just found that even with the current breast cancer landscape and all of the resources and investment and strategy that was applied to addressing this problem, it just seemed that there were still so many gaps. And a lot of the solutions that were being implemented, I felt like they were still so distant, so far away. And so the Chrysalis Initiative was born from there being a lack of support and resources for the unique challenges of Black women with breast cancer. And so I really just thought, how about a more direct strategic approach? And so the Chrysalis Initiative, like you mentioned, we have the coaching and navigation support for all ages, all races, all stages, primarily focused on Black women and women with breast cancer and other disparate groups. So we provide a reinforcement, kind of like a buffer, which is where the Chrysalis, comes from, where we are with you during that entire time, so that you know what quality care should feel like and look like, and what access to testing and treatment and all of that, what information should you be empowered with so that you can ensure that you have the best care. So that reinforcement and that buffer is for the patients. But at the same time, which if you think about the current landscape, nobody was dealing with the systemic bias and racism in the care setting, which is the largest contributor to these disparities in Black women. And so until we clean up what's going on in the healthcare setting and also in these clinical trials that are treating and interfacing with Black women, we're pretty much going to just be piecemealing solutions until that really is cleaned up. And I think we've gotten to a point in this country where we understand, yes, it's 2021, but these biases, this racism isn't going to go anywhere. So let's acknowledge that, let's own that, but have visibility and accountability. So that way you don't have gatekeepers or people that exhibit bias, or as Mayma mentioned, not recognizing, humanity of a person to even have all hands on deck or to provide care to a person who is vulnerable in their care, doesn't give them the opportunity to operate in a silo and cause harm to a patient without there being that accountability. So we provide equity assessments for clinical trials and cancer centers in all these areas that typically cancer centers and clinical trial sites have not had to respond to or have any accountability for, in order to make sure that they address these disparities on this side. And we find that when that's done, those disparities are eliminated. So the outcomes mirror their white counterparts more so. I was just reviewing data yesterday, and we have 10% of our Black metastatic patients that were told they shouldn't be here anymore. They were supposed to be, perished by now, and they're still here. So I think that's a testament to just having information and navigation support in this labyrinth of care, the impact of that and how that addresses disparities.
My goodness, how do you help someone with a response like that from their healthcare?
A lot of times it's, okay, we understand that it is possible that you're going to die, and maybe we have exhausted all options, right? But a lot of times we find that might not be the case. It's just that because there isn't that stake, because that humanity is not recognized, it really is that particular provider has checked out. And so when a person comes to us and they're saying, you know, my doctor has told me there's nothing else left on the table for me to try, let's assess that. Let's see if that's actually true. Let's see the history. Have you had genomic testing? And that is a big area where Black women typically don't even know that they were supposed to have genetic testing or genomic testing. To me, that's like not even having the subtype determined for your breast cancer, because it's that substantial as far as determining what your treatment should be. And so many times we find, oh, the genomic testing wasn't even done. Let's get that stat. Let's hurry up and get that done. And then we check to see what should be the current treatment. And we also have a team where we're looking to see now and at this point, you know, how can we connect them to maybe clinical trial options or second and third opinions in order to substantiate what their oncologist has told them. And a lot of times we're finding actually their options were not exhausted. There is more to do, and they're still living now.
Great. Well, there's some love for you in the chat box for doing this work, Jamil, and people also want to bottle your energy. So,
God, Wawa coffee.
I saw that big cup.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you. And we'll get back to some of your other work. Dr. Tatiana Prowl, we're so happy to have you with us today. You're an associate professor of oncology in the breast cancer program of Johns Hopkins Kimmel Comprehensive Cancer Center and the breast cancer scientific liaison at the Food and Drug Administration. Please tell us about how patient advocates contribute to the process of drug development, sort of from development to research questions, to participation in clinical trials, and how is the FDA itself addressing healthcare disparities?
It's such a great question. I just want to begin by saying thank you so much to Living Beyond Breast Cancer for having me here, and thank you for including me on this amazing panel. You know, I think that it wouldn't be appropriate to start without acknowledging that I'm on a panel full of Black women at a time that it is incredibly hard to be a Black woman in America. So I just want to say to the three of you for, you know, the emotional labor of getting yourselves together and being here on screen and presenting to an audience. I recognize that, and I see you, and thank you for being here, and thank you for letting me be a part of this. So this is a great question about how advocates contribute to clinical trials and drug development. And I have witnessed this change so much over time. So when I first started in my career, I graduated from medical school in 1999, and I almost never saw patient advocates. I didn't see patient advocates accompanying patients to visits. I can't recall ever meeting a patient advocate at a meeting, an oncology conference. The presence was just small. And if it took place at all, it was really taking place out of sight of physicians. There was not a lot of interplay between physicians and advocates, or between regulators and advocates, to sort of wear my two hats. Over time, you know, I think what we've witnessed is that we have now advocates at the table at every single stage. So we've got advocates coming into the clinic with patients, helping them ask the right questions about whether they're candidates for clinical trials, or what are the unique considerations for that particular patient about choosing whether or not to participate. We've watched patient advocates actually have a direct impact in terms of the design of clinical trials. So, you know, we've seen some of this work, for example, with the GRASP program, which I'm sure many of the people watching this are familiar with, but where you have clinicians and researchers and patients and patient advocates all partnered together doing a poster walk at a conference, or virtual poster walk at a conference at the moment, but where everybody is recognized as an expert. And, you know, I've participated in these as a mentor, and I'm always struck by the fact that I'm really not bringing more to that conversation than the advocates at all. I'm bringing a different thing to that conversation. And the advocates are saying, you know, how did they decide those sites? What about the people that don't live near those centers? Or what about the number of times you brought patients back? You know, have you thought about how much that excludes patients right there, people who can't afford to miss that much work or don't have that much childcare for all these extra visits. They just think about things in a way that I'm getting better at, but I don't naturally think about as a physician and somebody who's not a cancer survivor. So they certainly impact my thought process as I'm helping companies or individual investigators design clinical trials. I think from a practical standpoint, we're seeing an increasing role for patient advocates and advocacy organizations actually being funders of research, which historically has not been the case, right? Historically, you had clinical trials being funded by, or any kind of research, including basic science, being funded by either the government or industry, pharma. And now we actually have advocacy organizations funding individual investigators, funding projects, funding clinical trials, or serving as grant reviewers on, for example, NIH or DoD grant review panels to help decide which studies are going to go forward, which investigators are we going to invest in. And so that is just incredibly powerful. I think the other place that we've seen advocates really demanding to have a seat at the table, and I love this, is in saying we want to be in clinical trials, because we all hear this, these statistics, which are true, that you have single-digit percentage of patients, with cancer that are participating in clinical trials. And I think that it's been easy for the medical community to blame that on the patients and to say, why aren't they going on our trials, instead of saying, why are we failing to design clinical trials that these patients can participate in? Why aren't we designing trials that they're eligible for? Why aren't we designing trials that are easy to take part in? Why aren't we designing trials that have endpoints in them that they care about, or of drugs that are tolerable? And so, one place that has been very exciting to see advocacy involvement has been in modernizing eligibility criteria. So ASCO and Friends of Cancer Research partnered together. The work originally started back in about 2015 or 2016 and was finally published in 2017, the first round of recommendations. And all of those working groups that I was privileged to be a part of those and worked closely with the brain metastasis working group in particular. But all of those working groups included representatives from patient advocacy organizations. And what we found was we were excluding a lot of patients who could take part in clinical trials. And from the standpoint of thinking about minoritized people and cancer, what we found was that we were disproportionately excluding minoritized people from clinical trials. And I'll say that I should say this was never intentional. The purpose of those eligibility criteria was to protect patient safety. That was the starting point. But the other purpose of them was to have a patient population that was, at least in a biological sense, in a disease sense, as homogeneous as possible, so that you were changing just one variable, which is what treatment are they getting? Are they getting treatment A or treatment B? And everything else is being held the same. And we're going to see which one works better. The problem is when you try to conduct this very pure experiment like that, you end up selecting for what, again, I think Kelly Shanahan is here. I see her in the chat. She's called the Olympic patient. You end up selecting for people who, frankly, aren't very representative of the majority of people living with cancer. Yeah. And they're not, and so you leave out a lot of people, and you get results that may or may not be generalizable to the whole population of people with cancer. And so it's been terrific to see that work, which is focused on a variety of eligibility criteria that we have historically had, and that has questioned whether we really need all this stuff. Do we need patients to have perfect organ function, liver and kidney function? Do we need to exclude people with HIV and hepatitis B or C? Do we need to exclude people with brain metastases, people who have other comorbid medical conditions, people who've had treatment within some recent time period or a past malignancy? Almost all of those things will disproportionately exclude already minoritized patients. And so this is something that all of us felt very, very passionately about. Certainly those of us who see patients, I see patients for second opinions, and not having a clinical trial to offer someone, it feels like a failure to me, right? If they can choose not to go on it, and if we have a trial that someone's eligible for and they choose not to go on it, that also feels a little bit like a failure, because it says to me on some level, we haven't made this trial right for the sort of people that are coming in. We haven't made this easy enough to participate. We haven't made this important enough a question for them. But I think that modernizing these eligibility criteria gives us the opportunity to at least give the patients the choice to go in, instead of just throwing our hands up and saying, oh, only whatever percent of people go in clinical trials every year. Isn't that a shame? Like, let's fix it. The other place that that I've been very involved with, and FDA has been very involved with, is thinking about decentralized trials. So we had a listening session for patients with metastatic breast cancer. I think it's been probably 5 years ago now, maybe 4 years ago. But there were 5 representatives from the metastatic breast cancer community. And what we heard from them was that the eligibility criteria project was necessary and important, but it wasn't enough. And that a major barrier to participation was where trials were located, and how difficult it was for people to be able to get to a trial site, be able to participate in that trial, miss work, need childcare, have to pay out of pocket to fly somewhere, drive somewhere, take a bus somewhere, whatever the case may be. And so I've been very involved with work within the agency on decentralizing clinical trials. And I think you'll see more of this coming to fruition. Interestingly, one silver lining of the pandemic was that the pandemic forced us to say, can we do this stuff right now? Can we actually have patient visits conducted via telemedicine? Is it really necessary to bring all these people here? Could the people get the scans where they are? Could they get the labs where they are? Could they even get the study drug in some cases where they are with their local oncologist? And then we have data collection where that is centralized. So one thing that's been interesting is, because of COVID-19, the Oncology Center of Excellence at FDA has actually been loosening up some of these restrictions and trying to make clinical trials more flexible, responsive to the pandemic. And we're now actually asking companies to flag which data was collected in a remote site versus a main site, to see, is there really no difference or no meaningful difference between this kind of data? Because if there's not, let's make this easy for people. Let's let them be able to be a part of this.
That would be a great outcome of the pandemic. Is the FDA, we have a question for you, is the FDA working to encourage pharma to be more inclusive in their clinical trials?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So, we do encourage pharma to be inclusive, and this is a personal, quirk of mine. Whenever I see clinical trials that are excluding anyone, I will tell companies, you need to provide a scientific justification for excluding these patients. So a classic example of this has been breast cancer in men, where when I started at the FDA, there were no breast cancer clinical trials that enrolled men, period, not one, none. And after seeing some patients in clinic and realizing this person is an ideal candidate for this clinical trial, except he's a man. And I just thought, this doesn't make any sense. And when I started talking to industry about this and said, why are we excluding them? I heard 2 things. One was, there aren't that many of them. But to me, I say, well, if there aren't that many of them, they're probably not going to change the overall results of your study. So let's let them in. And the other thing that I heard was, well, we don't know that much about breast cancer in men. We don't know how it might be different. To which I would say, to which I have said repeatedly, that's why we do clinical trials, to find out stuff we don't know. So if we don't know much about breast cancer in men, that's the reason to put them in, not the reason to leave them out. And what we have seen is that now virtually all global phase 3 randomized trials in breast cancer permit men to join. There are very rare exceptions where there really is a biological reason to think that that cancer might be different in them, but it is super rare. And even earlier phase studies, most of those now include men. And any of the ones that I see the protocols for, I say you need to provide me scientific justification for excluding men or add them to the protocol. And there's no scientific justification. That almost always results in their being added. So, that's a personal victory. So we do this, and I think some of us have done this on an individual level as we see protocols for many years. And slowly, this has kind of become the standard. But FDA does also do this, and we raise these issues in our reviews. Issues of enrollment of people of different races or different minoritized groups are part of every single review. Where we have data that's of value, we have it in the label. We don't always have it, but where we have it, you'll find it there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We'll get back to some of these issues. Great discussion. So Stephanie Walker. Stephanie was diagnosed de novo with MBC in 2015. And in 2019, Stephanie, we were able to welcome you into the Hear My Voice Metastatic Advocacy Program. And since that time, you have been incredibly busy in a variety of projects, including you've taken on the lead in the Become project at the Metastatic Breast Cancer Alliance, and really following up on some of the conversation here around clinical trials. I'm going to ask you to explain it, but I do also want to say that you built this this effort on Marina Kaplan's work. She was a fellow Hear My Voice advocate in 2019, and she was an epidemiologist, and she started to survey, and why are people with metastatic breast cancer not involved in clinical trials? And thus she started something, and now the Become project is really delving into this. So tell us about it.
Well, thank you for having me here. Amongst all these women are amazing, truly amazing. I was just sitting here almost napping, tired, listening to Jamil, thinking, and I'm not even doing that kind of work. But the truth is, yes, Marina did her survey. We met at the San Antonio Breast Cancer Symposium in 2019. And her study or her survey that she did regarding clinical trials, she was really shocked that only 8.87% of the respondents were Black or African American. So the discussion was initiated, by another advocate as to why was that? Why weren't there a larger number of respondents that were Black? So she asked if I would do the study again, and aimed at basically at the Black MBC community. With that being said, even though there are 15% of the cancer patients are Black, less than 6% participate in a clinical trial. So to find a solution to those barriers that we all know that exist in clinical trials, in the history that we all hear, the Tuskegee Airmen and the Henrietta Lack story and a few others, those were something we all know that those are deterrents for women or men, in clinical trials. So we came up with an idea to do this. And unfortunately, Marina passed away before we could get it completed. So I just, knowing me, being the nurse that I am, I put that project on the back burner, thinking that, not being disrespectful of the project in a whole, but I didn't know how to do a survey. My idea of doing a survey was taking a piece of paper, writing down some questions, putting it on a Xerox machine and copying them off and then mailing them out to people and pray somebody would mail them back. But obviously that's not the way it's done. So LBBC contacted me actually and asked me about, where was I in the process of the survey. Well, I hadn't done anything. So we decided that it was important. It really was important. But I, as one person, didn't know how to do this. So we actually approached the Metastatic Breast Cancer Alliance and sat down and talked to them about it. And the Information Task Force accepted this as a project. So the project name Become is a Black experience of clinical trials and opportunities for meaningful engagement. This is a patient-driven initiative that reflects the diversity of the MBC community, where we see patients and organizations hopefully draw together around and the needs and the ideas that impact one of us impacts us all. So as we talk, as I said, racial disparities have come to light, obviously, since COVID-19 has gotten us all in, has actually brought the healthcare disparities to light, more so than before. And then also, not to mention, the Black Lives Matter has also brought Black people to the forefront and made those that were less likely to be verbal, to be more verbal and allies. So when we looked at this with the Metastatic Breast Cancer Alliance, we found that this project would align with some of their goals. And one of their goals was to advance research focused on extending life, enhancing quality of life, and ultimately ending death from MBC. And the second goal, improving knowledge by ensuring all patients and their caregivers, regardless of color, know how to and can access the care and services they need from a responsive and well-informed healthcare system. And the third goal that we aligned with was increasing understanding of MBC and how it differs from early stage breast cancer among those diagnosed, their families, healthcare providers, researchers, and also the health policy experts.
And Stephanie, when is you're getting ready to field the survey? Is that right?
Correct. We have got a lot of work done already. We've had the lit review done, which was the literature that was reviewed was a combination of what ASCO and the Association of Community Cancer Centers considered as important studies that were done. And those actually were done, published, and there were 29 articles and had the statistics regarding clinical trials of cancer patients. So once those 29 articles were reviewed, she actually put them in a summary or an executive summary, and that was where we got our discussion guides. The interviews that were done were 32 based on, they were patients, clinicians, administrators, researchers, and payers. So those people were interviewed from the 29 articles that they thought that were important points. After those were interviewed, we have a draft for survey questions that came from those key informants. So we are actually now working on the survey with the first draft that has to be reviewed by our PI. We're also looking for awaiting IRB approval for this project. And it will be posted out there with social media ambassadors that are located throughout the US that have volunteered to help push it out in their community. The community that we're shooting for, and it's not being disrespectful of the people that are here, but it's those that aren't here. We need to get more people that are out in those rural communities or the smaller communities that go to those community-based cancer center. 80% of us go to those type of centers, not the NCI center. So we're trying to reach those people that have metastatic breast cancer and that are African American. So our goals are to actually have meaningful outcomes, actionable outcomes that not only the Alliance members see as actionable, but maybe some solutions that some of the nonprofits and industry and individual members can utilize and take back to their communities.
So Stephanie, what I'm hearing is that you're going to use the data to inform other solutions kind of throughout the, advocates, pharma, researchers, et cetera. You're going to take the solutions forward. Is that right?
Correct. We hope to get, we will, I'm not going to say hope, we will get solutions. We just need to, once that's all done, to take those back, we need to have, we have to, everyone has said on this panel that you have to start with the clinicians. That is, we have to. We just have to start there. They're racially biased to begin with. So we do need that education there. We want to have changes. We need to have, especially when it comes to the inclusion-exclusion criteria, as Dr. Prowse said, with the clinical trials, 9 times out of 10, we are excluded from these trials. But when those medications come to and through the FDA to be approved, we as Black or African American people are given that drug. So I don't understand, with those exclusion criteria, we're excluded in the beginning because we're not good enough, but then at the end, we're the ones that are getting the medications. So I truly am looking for change with the exclusion inclusion criteria that I know from the survey that we'll get information just like that.
Great. And people have been saying in the chat that the Metastatic Breast Cancer Alliance will be pushing the survey out, and LBBC will be one of those.
Yeah, there'll be a
toolkit.
Yes, there will be a toolkit on our landing page from the Metastatic Breast Cancer Alliance.org / become, and there's going to be a toolkit that people can go there and get the survey, could possibly print it off there. And also we're working on a paper version as well.
Great. I'm going to turn back to Dr. Prowl. I think Jamil is trying to reconnect. But Dr. Prowl, in light of everything that Stephanie said, some, clinical trials have been an issue, but also there's evidence that Black women experience some medications differently. And there's been a little bit of research, but not a lot. You were an author of a recent study on, I'm going to look at my notes here, ethnicity-based differences into breast cancer features and responsiveness in CDK4/6 inhibitors combined with endocrine therapies. Can you tell us how researchers formulated that question, and what are some of the other questions that researchers are looking into?
Yeah, it's a great question, and honestly, sort of a sad story. So we were interested because CDK inhibitors, so these are drugs like palbociclib, abemaciclib, ribociclib. For people who aren't familiar with that class name, these are drugs that are FDA approved in combination with aromatase inhibitors and fulvestrant or Faslodex for treatment of hormone receptor positive, HER2 negative breast cancer in both women and men. And one reason that we decided to do this study, which was basically pooling all the data that we had from every industry-sponsored trial that was conducted to support an FDA approval. So we had 7 of those altogether, about 4,000 patients. And we were interested because these drugs have shown large progression-free survival benefits, and for some of them in certain settings, overall survival benefits, but they're expensive. And they do come with toxicity. We were interested in figuring out whether there are some groups of patients who actually might do quite well with just endocrine therapy alone, which is lower cost, which has fewer side effects. And so we decided to look at several subgroups that historically we believed are differentially sensitive. Their tumors are differentially sensitive to endocrine therapy. So we looked at patients who had PR negative, progesterone receptor negative metastatic breast cancer. We looked at women with lobular breast, in these studies, most of them were women, but patients with lobular breast cancers, patients who were young, patients who had bone-only metastatic disease, patients who had had a very short interval from their initial diagnosis to their recurrence of metastatic breast cancer, to just say, do we see that CDK inhibitors seem to be providing more or less or the same benefit to all these different subgroups? And the overall findings of that study, which were published in Lancet Oncology, was that every subgroup we looked at seemed to benefit, and they seemed to benefit pretty similar magnitude. Interestingly, we wanted to look at race, and what we found was in the groups where we could actually compare progression-free survival. So those were the subsets of trials where patients had received CDK inhibitors in combination with aromatase inhibitors. We had about 400 patients who were Asian. We only had 43, I believe, Black patients in that whole data set. So I will tell you that you can't even make an estimate that would be credible with only 43 patients when you're looking across an entire class of drugs. I can't say anything conclusive. So when I have 400 patients who are Asian, even though that's still a post hoc analysis and it's not definitive, what we saw was that Asian patients, if anything, seemed to benefit even more than white patients. They actually had on average about 6 months greater improvement in progression-free survival, median progression-free survival, than the white patients did when they had a CDK inhibitor added to their endocrine therapy. But I really cannot make an estimate like that for Black patients or for Latinx patients because there are so few of them. And so this really just underscores this point that for whatever reason, we are conducting clinical trials that we're not accruing these minoritized patients to. We are either excluding them with the inclusion exclusion criteria, or they're too burdensome on time, or they're located in communities where Black patients or Latinx patients maybe are less likely to live. Or maybe they're not even being offered clinical trials. You know, I don't want to remove the physicians from the blame of this because we deserve the blame of this, right? It's not just researchers, it's also clinicians who deserve the blame of this. We are less likely to offer minoritized patients participation in clinical trials. So this is for a variety of reasons, right? At the heart of them all is racism. But for a variety of reasons, people might say, I don't think this patient would be able to make it to all of those visits. But we substitute our judgment instead of saying, hey, could you make it to all these visits? And if not, what do we need to fix about our clinical trials infrastructure so that a patient like you in the future will be able to? Or we might say, oh, this patient doesn't qualify, you know, she's got all these other medical issues. I'm sure that's going to exclude her. But then we say, do we really need to exclude all those patients for having uncontrolled diabetes? Because you can be sure that when this drug is out on the market, someone with uncontrolled diabetes is going to be prescribed it, not just someone, a lot of people, right? And so I think that the challenge that we have is how do we actually have diverse enough clinical trial populations to ensure that everybody who wants access to an investigational agent can get it through the clinical trials mechanism where their safety is maximized and where we have the capacity to learn from their experience. How do we do that? And then how do we have confidence on the back end that we've enrolled a diverse enough clinical trial population that the results are applicable to them? Because that is a terrible position to be in as a clinician when a patient says, you know, well, how about people like me? Were there people like me in this trial? Were there people who have uncontrolled high blood pressure? Or were there people who have whatever condition to say, oh no, those patients were excluded, right? We're struggling with this right now with COVID-19 vaccines because patients with cancer were excluded from all of those clinical trials. And so when patients ask me, do you think that I don't think there's a reason to think that the safety will be less good. There's no biologically or scientifically plausible reason the safety should be different in a patient with cancer or cancer history. But when they say, will these work as well in me? Am I as likely to be protected? I don't know, because those patients were not included in those clinical trials. And so, you know, I think this is the challenge that we have is how do we get those folks in the trials? The other challenge is trust. Right. And I think that no matter how much we try, I try so hard to be a safe space for Black patients, for Latinx patients who are coming into my clinic, for LGBTQ patients who are coming into my clinic. But I'm a white woman and there is no getting around that. And it's different when you have a person who is a member of your own community asking you if you want to participate in that clinical trial. I'm well aware of all the history of medicine. I'm well aware that racism is still a problem today, and it's still going to be a problem on Monday, and there's no changing that. And so the other piece of this, I think, is that we really need a diverse workforce. And, you know, that's something that I care about a lot. I mentor a lot of physicians in training and aspiring physicians who are people of color. FDA has a formal mentorship program actually called the OCE Summer Scholars Program, where members of groups that are identified as National Science Foundation underrepresented in STEM actually come for the summer, and they are completely embedded in the whole process of learning about drug development and how we make approval decisions. And they're paired up with mentors, of which I'm one. So I think ultimately we need a more diverse workforce so that when you ask me a question 5 years from now, what did this study show? I can say, well, here's what it showed in Black women, and actually believe that there's any validity to those results I'm telling you, because it's not just 43 patients out of thousands.
It may, that may be a good area for patient advocates to get involved in. Mayma, I'm going to throw it to you now. You were involved in the 2020 San Antonio Breast Cancer Symposium. You actually brought in researchers and advocates who talked about healthcare disparities. And I'm wondering if you can tell us how that's a pretty big accomplishment to open this major breast cancer research conference with a discussion like this. And it was fantastic. And it was a mix of both advocates and scientists. And can you tell us a little bit about how you did that?
Thank you. Yes. I mean, as you're asking me now, I'm getting very emotional because I think of the advocates who were there, like Nani Reese, who I was on our board and I adore her, who is no longer with us because of health disparities that she faced during COVID, before COVID, and that led to her, now, being an angel in heaven. I simply had to ask San Antonio Breast what my Black and Brown sisters deserve to have. It's our right to be at those tables. When I first went to San Antonio years ago, I was just going as a patient. Tiger Lily wasn't yet this big as it was. And I walked into the center and I was just overwhelmed. There were people running around with these books and they're brainiacs and they're talking about science and research and trials. And I felt so overwhelmed. And I began to ask questions, but nobody was really telling me what the conference was supposed to do and how could I be involved in these solutions. So whenever I'm the kind of person, like a little kid, I'm really annoying. I'm like, why, but why, but why not? And why isn't this happening? And so I kept asking people, like, what is this about? And how can I be on that stage? How can I share my opinions? How do I help the patients that I'm serving in Detroit, in Southeast DC, in these communities of color that don't get to be at San Antonio, represent their voices, to be part of the trials and treatments and solutions and outcomes? And I kept hearing the same phrase, we don't do it that way. It's not how it's done. And that is one of my biggest pet peeves. Don't tell me how it's not how it's done, because you can always change everything. We could find COVID-19 vaccines in 6 months, 3 of them at least. How can we not find a way to ensure patients of color are at the table at the largest conference for patients who are breast cancer patients in the world? And so I kept thinking about, why isn't this working? And so I called them and I said, let me just ask you a question. If you're a scientist and a researcher or a provider, don't you work for us? Then you take an oath to protect your patient. And if you did, that includes having us have our voices at the table at this conference. And so when we first had our own event in 2019, we had it at the Minger. But then I thought, why am I, the Black woman, having a conference outside the center, the main center, at an adjacent hotel? That's disrespectful as hell. Like, we should be in the room with the doctors and scientists on the stage. And so I began to ask San Antonio, how do you commit to diversity and inclusion? How do you commit to allyship? How do you look at the inherent biases that prevent you from including me, the Black patient, at the table? And so there were a lot of conversations, a lot of talks. And I said, you guys are the expert in cancer and science, and we're the experts in living with the disease and living with soul. So you work for us, and we want to support you to help us get our Black and Brown patients at the table to create equitable outcomes for those patients. And so it took a long time, but if you know me, Kathy, I am freaking relentless as hell. I called, emailed, harassed. And finally we had some conversations and I said, here's what I want. And I didn't ask for it. I think as people of color, we tend to feel like we have to ask sometimes to be at these tables, but I began to say, you know what? It is my right to be here. It's Jamil's right to be here. It's, Nani's right to be here. It's Stephanie's right to be here with you as a scientist, co-creating solutions for our population. And so we ended up just having these really deep conversations. In San Antonio Breast, they're an amazing organization, but they're big, right? So they had to go through levels of approval to make sure that this could be done in a way that they could manage work, because I'm not manageable sometimes. And but I really am thankful that we came together, and AACR was amazing. And I just said to them, what would it be like if you had a patient of color ask the right research question, help design the right research study, and be a part of creating the solutions? To Stephanie's point, I don't want people like myself at every table. I want the women that don't know this exist, that don't know Tatiana or San Antonio Breast or an ASCO or an ACR. I want them to be in the room to learn about treatments, trials, outcomes, the science of cancer and why it happens, to go back home and help to eliminate mistrust, build bridges, and so forth. And so it was a powerful conference. Honestly, when I was on the platform talking, I was like, is this really happening right now? Because I had been, working towards it for so long. And I came here alone at 15 as a refugee. You know, I was like, I came from a country that was war torn, where the health equity situation is way worse than here in the States. And to be on that platform as the first time actually having a patient-led, patient advocacy-led, Black female-led organization open the conversation was really powerful. And what was really cool is that when the patients were able to ask questions and ask the scientists questions, there were some things they couldn't really answer. They hadn't thought about them. So immediately it showed the power of engaging patients first. So imagine how many dollars have been lost and spent or wasted when they create these studies without patients, and they waste all this money and people die needlessly. And if they were to ask that same question that I asked, but why not? And then engage us. And so really it helped to shift the entire mindset. And, you know, we're having it again this year. We're planning the conference. I know we're almost at the end.
So we are.
We're planning the end, and I'm looking forward to sharing with all of you guys the program in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, I wanted everyone to have closing statements, but I'm going to throw this to Jamil because we dropped you for a second. But so, Jamil, how do you get corporations and other people to talk about patient centricity? Because it's a term that's out there, but you're really, you know, disrupting to make it happen. And we do have to close right at 3. So
yes, so I think to sum up, we just have to really emphasize the fact that it's bad for business for you know, trials and studies and research not to include patients from the gate. I mean, you're going to have better ROI, you're going to have better outcomes, you're going to have better insights, and it's actually going to meet the needs of patients. And I think we also have to shift this view that, you know, research and these clinical trials are only for outcomes and data, and that patients are subjects, and that there is patient care, especially when we're talking about metastatic patients. If you are enrolling a metastatic patient in a clinical trial, you're providing care. You know, so let's get out of this, you know, thinking that, oh, this is only subjects and outcomes and, you know, tumors. There are people attached to these tumors, and you are providing care. And I think it's just, you know, the sponsors now with the funding, and also the FDA putting out their statement about requiring diversity and equity in clinical trials. That's really the first step in having patients at the table, not just after the fact, not just included, you know, as subjects, you know, participating, but being part of the planning process and also having diverse teams.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank such a great panel for this great discussion.
It's already done.
It's already done it. I knew it would go fast.